Donatien, David Hockney has done twice your portrait. How does it work?
For David to decide to paint somebody's portrait, it's a very personal decision. So what it means is that he needs to feel a particular connection to that person. It's very democratic. Could be anyone, could be a very famous person, could be somebody nobody has heard of, because in a way he makes a decision, he makes that choice. So first, in order to be painted by David Hockney, well, it's very basic. You need to meet David Hockney. You need to be part of his circle. And I've been very fortunate over the last 15 years now to have become part of Hockneyland, what I call jokingly Hockneyland, this extraordinary world in which people have been here for, at times, decades. And
in LA, right?
In LA, we met at his studio, his famous studio on Hollywood Hills. And then we became correspondents. I wrote about him, I interviewed him. Actually interviewed him before writing about him. And then what happened is that at some point during lockdown, he was making these series of paintings on iPad of, Normandy. And he would send the newly made work to a loop of people, of his friends. And I decided to respond to each email, to write my comments, my thoughts on his work. And then I became his pen pal. So then one day he asked me to come to Normandy, and I went to visit him in Normandy. And then Jean Frémont runs Galerie Le Long, was a very close friend of David's and a very important poet, has written a very important text on David, asked me to write for a monograph that they were doing. And I used this quote that David told me Derrida was wrong, which kind of fascinated me as, a scholar, that David Hockney would tell me about Derrida's kind of this amazing connection of worlds. So then I wrote the piece, David liked the piece, and then he wrote to me and said, would you like to sit for me? And I went to Normandy and I stayed overnight and I was in front of him and he painted me. And it was extraordinary because David now paints without drawing first. When you make a portrait and you make a painting in the classical way he makes them, you draw the lines, you create the structure, and then you paint. That's what our masters have done for centuries. He doesn't go straight to the canvas. So, which is extremely
But he can draw also.
He's one of the greatest draftsmen alive. He can draw like Degas, he can draw like Picasso, he can draw like Ingres. He's one of the greatest draftsmen alive.
He studied Ingres.
He studied Degas, he studied Picasso. He's really one of the greatest draftsmen alive. But he's decided to leave it aside. And that's interesting, to really concentrate on the painting and on the direct expression of you. Interestingly, his relation to you is one of architecture. He's looking at all the detail. He's looking at my scarf as much as he's looking at my face. He's looking at my hands, looking at the chair as much as he's looking at me. So in that sense, it's very much about the architecture of things. So the first day I sat, then, we had dinner and had a lovely night in Normandy, and then the next day I sat again. And
so many hours.
Well, yeah, but it takes time. And then at the end, when he finished, he said, "Your mother's not gonna like it," and he was right. My mother didn't like it, but it was interesting because for him, it's this dialogue with you, with the architecture of the image, with the geometry of you, how my nose relates to my chin, relates to my jacket and everything. And then there was this exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery a year and a half later, which is kind of a rehash of another exhibition they had done before. And there was a new series of Normandy portraits, and I was exhibited. And I studied in the UK. So, of course, as a Frenchman who studied in the UK and speaks with an American accent, having my portrait at the National Portrait Gallery, I found it very entertaining. So I went.
But why did he choose you, you think? Why does he choose the mayor of the city or the milkman?
I think the key thing is we are in our worlds at a certain moment. The paintings he paints are the portraits of the people who encounter him. Some of them may be famous, some of them may be, not famous, but you are part of his world. And that's also the reason why he's painted many portraits of Sylvia Birtwell, many portraits of JP, many portraits of Jonathan, the people who really surround him, many portraits of Albert, the son of Ossie Clark and Celia. We in a way, one of the key things about David Hockney is his relation to his world. In a way, he's very democratic, but at the same time, he's a king. I mean, in a way, in England, there's Queen Elizabeth. There was Queen Elizabeth, and there's David Hockney.
And you wrote that he refused to become noble.
Yeah, I mean, it's a common fact. He didn't want to become a nobleman. He was never made Sir. He's not Sir David Hockney. He's not Lord David Hockney.
He refused, really.
I mean, from what I heard, yeah, because he didn't want. He occupies another space. I mean, the space he occupies is his own space that is at once extremely democratic, because and his work is extremely democratic, but at the same time extremely precise and self-standing.
But why is his work democratic?
As what I was saying about the portraits, from the moment you encounter him, you can find yourself in it. It's not social portraiture. You don't need to be somebody this or that. You just encounter him, and if you encounter him, can be his nurses, whom he's portraying now.
And so what are the difference between the two portraits he did of you?
But I'll just answer the previous question on democratic. I think there's an aspect of his work which is to be open to everyone. You can embrace it, you can encounter it, you can just, to use an American phrase, enjoy it. But at the same time, when you start looking into it, when you start digging into it, when you start looking into the architecture of it, there's so much to say. And to answer your other question about the portraits he did of me, I think, when the first was on show at the NPG in London, he said, I would like to do a second one. And then the second one is even more his relation to our history and to himself, because, of course, portraits are also portraits of himself at a certain point. Portraits of others are also portraits of himself at a certain point. Because what happened is that at some point, he was starting to paint my portrait, and he was wanting to paint this gesture I sometimes do, which is to rub my hands like this. And then I asked him this question, kind of a stupid question, but what was your relation to Francis Bacon? And then he answered that the relation between the two of them was a little complicated. And then, based on that, I saw the twist in the portrait, that in a way the portrait became his way to address Bacon. and so in a way he has done in the past. He has made works addressing Auerbach, addressing Freud, addressing Picasso, of course.
You ought to have spoken about Botticelli. You would have been so beautiful, and your mom would have been happy.
Well, something else happened. But that famous phrase that Picasso said to Gertrude Stein, Gertrude Stein needs to look like my portrait just shouldn't look like Gertrude Stein.
Well, but it does, in fact. Unluckily for Gertrude. And what do you think about the relation of David to art history?
I think his relation to art history is sort of multi-layered. In a way, first of all, you have to remember that when you would grow up in the 50s in Britain, our history was a very specifically located thing socially. Like people like Anthony Blunt, the Courtauld, were very privileged. David doesn't come from that background. So in a way, what he's done is to take on the position of the artist as art historian. And he's written pieces of our history. He's written this important book on perspective. He was also one of the very early ones, already in the 70s and early 80s, to sort of stand for late Picasso. He did a very important lecture at the Guggenheim on late Picasso very early on. Mm-hmm. So in a way, he has that gesture of working as an historian. Then as a painter, he's taken on history. It's become part of him, and he references it all along. He writes history with his work. He writes history with the work of others. And in a way, it's sort of as if he was addressing time all along. And now what's interesting is that you can see him, addressing even his own history. One of the things that struck me when I saw the image of the final self-portrait he made, that will be the closing of the upcoming exhibition at the Fondation Louis Vuitton, is that in a way, the self-portrait is a self-portrait as David Hockney. You can see him addressing all the many images of him, and in a way being his own historian. So I would say history is at the center, but it's also not a contradiction of presence. It's both at the same time.
I interviewed him recently, and I spoke about Vermeer, La Petite Rue, the small street, and because it's a play in a play in a play, exactly as his self-portrait. And he said, wow, I didn't think about it. He was very excited about this aspect.
Yes, because he looks, in a way, this goes back to the question you asked me before. In a way, the works are very direct, but they're also multi-layered. And in a way, they all tell the stories of all these things that he has seen that are part of history.
Processed.
Exactly. It's a constant process of rewriting history in the present, which is interesting because in a way, he's been described as a postmodern artist, somebody who, takes on all of history in his work, but at the same time, he still is somebody who builds up and expands history.
Merci, monsieur.
Merci beaucoup.